Hello and welcome to On the Record, the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian. The cost of a hurricane can be measured with so many different metrics. The loss of life can never be quantified even now. 3 months after Hurricane Dorian, there are families still without the closure of saying goodbye to missing loved ones. Then there are the homes, businesses, monuments, and even a way of life for so many of our people. And the costs continue to mount. This week, a deep dive into the financial implications of Hurricane Dorian. My guest is an expert in these matters. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Our discussion begins on the other side of this break.
Bring in the Christmas season with the crew from Sappadilla Street as we celebrate our 10th show anniversary. That's right, Christmas on Sappadilla Street 5, St. John's College Auditorium, Saturday, December 7th at 8 p.m. and Sunday, December 8th at 5 p.m. Tickets, $20 adults and $10 children. Available at Sheffy's Deli and Grill, Rosetta Street, Lil Mustard Seed Healthy Cafe, Mount Royal Avenue, and Screws and Fasteners World, Balfour Avenue and Palm Beach Street. Call 466-7996 or 812-5524. Come and join the celebration to laugh until you cry.
Within the 3 months since the storm, we have seen some significant strides made in the recovery effort, yet we are still a far ways off from returning to a state of normalcy. Tonight, we'll be discussing the long-lasting implications of Hurricane Dorian from a financial aspect. Joining me tonight is former director and CEO of the Bahamas Chamber of Commerce and Employees Confederation, Mr. Edison Sumner. Mr. Sumner, welcome to On the Record. I want to first talk in broad terms about the overall impact of Dorian. When you look at our country and what we have come through, and more importantly, what we are still facing, let's talk broadly about how this has impacted our financial well-being.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for me being here. Let's begin with looking at the landscape of the areas that were impacted by Hurricane Dorian. I've had the occasion to visit what we call Ground Zero, both in Marsh Harbor, surrounding areas, as well as in Grand Bahama. Right? We went into Freeport and some of the, what they call over the bridge area in the east side. And it would appear, looking at it, that, that literally that a bomb was released in the center of those communities and just exploded everything. So the first thing we've got to consider, even before you get into the financial implications of this hurricane, is what has been the psychological impact of this, and that's going to have an impact on everything else that we're doing. Now, when you look at the financial implications of it, though, you're talking about the second and third largest economies of the Bahamas. Abaco arguably will tell you that they're the second economy, right, because of how well they've been doing over the years. Grand Bahama has had its challenges for quite some time. But in any instance, between those two islands, they contributed as much as 20% or so towards the GDP of the country. So anything that impacts the economy of Abaco and that impacts the economy of Grand Bahama will have an impact on the economy of the country. So the implications are, we're talking now well into the billions of dollars, right, in excess of $3 billion in estimated losses. And the losses, unfortunately, aren't the kind of losses that can be easily recovered through, say, an insurance program, because we are finding out now from recent reports that came out that there are more and more homeowners and businesses in both communities, particularly in Grand Bahama, who we find out didn't have the requisite insurance on their properties. So now that is a burden that is going to fall again to the government and the people of the Bahamas to try and find a way to support these individuals, these families, these businesses, to get back in business, to get back into their homes, to get back to some level of normalcy in their living and lifestyle. But the financial implications are significant. I think it's significant to the point that we are going to have to go out now back into the international community to see how we can generate support through grants or donations from high net worth individuals and other multilateral agencies to support us in getting the capital that is needed to get back up in business. And this may be done through, we heard the government announced that they may be applying for a loan to support its shortfalls. It's going to come through something that I know the government is currently pursuing, where they're looking to go after some grant funding through a pledging conference that they'll be talking about, I'm sure, at some point soon. But the financial implications are going to be significant. It is not going to take us even the next 5 or 10 years to recover from all of this. It's going to be a very long process, because what we're dealing with here is a destruction of parts of our economy that took generations to build, and that was destroyed in a matter of 3 days. And now it may take a whole generation to get some of it back, but to the degree that we are moving rapidly, because I've been to Abaco more than once to look at what we saw there, and we have seen some improvements, right? Land being cleared. There's still a tremendous amount of buildings that are sitting there that are in ruins, commercial buildings, private residences, and the rest of it. So the fact that many persons didn't have requisite protection on those properties is going to mean that they're going to spend a much longer time getting those properties back in shape. But while that's happening, we have to still try to build an economy. We've got to return trade and commerce to these areas. But to return trade and commerce to these areas, there has to be a market that you have to sell to. And your market is your people. So if the people aren't there, if the disposable income isn't there, if the spending isn't there, then we still have a challenge with getting this done. So what we're facing then is sort of a two-edged sword, so to speak, a quid pro quo in some ways, where you have to give and take in some instances. So we want to build the economy of these islands again. We want to not only build them, but we want to see some resiliency in our building, sustained development in how we approach the rebuilding efforts. But while we're rebuilding on the one hand, we've got to ensure that there's a market to absorb what we're doing on the other hand. So there has to be a significant amount of work being done in tandem, one on the consumer side, one on the development side, to be sure that we're moving this machine together so that we can bring the resources in, the people in, the businesses in, bring the international investors back into these communities who are prepared to invest in these communities. But even in doing that, it's a challenge telling an international investor at this point to come in to spend $100 million on a development on one of these islands when we cannot demonstrate yet how we're going to show that we can actually rebuild these islands in a more sustainable way, that the footprint, technology footprint that we're putting down is going to be sustainable, it's going to be able to mitigate against any future losses that we might face in this kind of a situation. So there is going to be a lot of heavy lifting that's required by the government and the people of the country.
Now, you know, when you're looking at recovery, obviously the business community and what their needs are will be very significant. Mm-hmm. But how important is it to get your infrastructure in place? Because while the cleanup is important and while so many other things are important, if I don't have electricity or basic infrastructural needs met, how am I going to operate?
Well, see, that's the challenge now. When we talk about the development and sustained development aspect of what we're dealing with, you cannot build, in this modern times, you cannot build a community without certain infrastructure in place. You need all the utilities in place, and we're seeing that in those communities impacted by the hurricane, they're still operating largely off of generators, right, to generate electricity for themselves. We know that there was a time, particularly in the Grand Bahama area, where they were concerned about potable water and the water table being contaminated. So there was a challenge with getting clean water into the community. We know that from the telecommunication side, that they worked feverishly, and I think they were the first utilities that were actually back up and running in both communities. So hats off to the two telecoms companies who worked feverishly and together to bring that utility back up and running. But when we talk about developing these communities, you have to look at what is going to be the need going forward. And this is where, at this point, planning becomes important, right? So we cannot just, well, in my view, you cannot go back into these communities and say we're simply going to rebuild. You've got to plan these cities out now, right? Grand Bahama, we know, is well planned for many years ago with Wallace Groves and the people that followed. So we know that is a well-designed city. But it now requires, I think, some further design and planning on resiliency, sustainable development, climate change matters that we all now are concerned about. But for that to happen, you've got to plan out where communities are going to be developed, where you're going to run your infrastructure to service those communities. Do we look now at developing a new community that we didn't consider before? It may be out of the center of where things have happened. You have to look at the size of the population that's coming in, population shift. And you've got to look at your demographics as well, because everything, and this is where you start talking about smart city planning, smart development planning, right? So if we know that the entire world is shifting towards digital economy, a digital transformation, where the entire world is shifting towards automation, it doesn't make sense to put things back in place there before that were considered archaic in the first place and to rebuild them. You've got to now augment your plans, but there has to be a map drawn of what is the current situation, or was the situation prior to Dorian, where are we now, and where do we intend for these communities to be in the next, say, 10 to 15 years. And it doesn't only mean for those two islands that were impacted, because this now gives us the perfect opportunity, as we would have had from from Matthew and Joaquin and Irma. We didn't take the full advantage of those opportunities. But now that we have been impacted by the worst catastrophe that's ever hit this country, it gives us a chance now to look at the entire country and map this country out, right? How do we now look at the areas in the country that are not as prone to hurricanes as other parts of the country? And how do we look at advancing discussions about the redevelopment of Grand Bahama? It's a massive island that is grossly underutilized, right? How do we look at shifting resources to places like Andros? Andros is an island that is larger than many Caribbean countries combined. So there's massive land space, massive natural resources that we need to consider. And then when we came out of the last hurricane season in 2015-16, I think it was, when we had the Southeast Islands that were decimated by the hurricanes, there was a plan then to talk about green island development, sustainable city development. I'm not sure exactly what's happened there, but based on what we've seen, there hasn't been any real moves in that regard yet. But this gives, I think, those who may be advising the government an opportunity to help the government plan out their future for these islands, but for the entire country. And it's going to cost some money, but...
Well, that was my other question. You know, the planning, obviously very important, necessary, and I think there is no secret that we lack a culture of planning in this country in many aspects. Yeah, very much so. Ad hoc and reactionary once things happen. But when you talk about planning and you're talking about rethinking communities, even in Grand Bahama, there's a discussion about whether they keep the airport where it is.
Right.
There's a possibility now you're looking at moving the airport. You can only begin to imagine the price tag that comes along with that. Yeah. All these things cost money.
Right. But opportunity as well.
But how do you begin financially planning for these things? Because you don't just say, well, hey, we're going to move a community.
Yeah. But this is where, the burden of doing this does not have to rest with government. Government, I think, at this point, can be the catalyst behind it, right? The government can be the ones to go out now and appeal to the international community. to the international investment community, the government doesn't have to rebuild the airport on its own. Although I think they should have some ownership of it because of the issue of security and transportation and all of that. But I'm sure that if we were to go out into the international community and we say, listen, we're looking for investors to help us rebuild this airport, it's going to cost you $200 million, right? Look at this as an investment in the country, and you become a part owner of this facility. I'm sure you're going to find a number of airport development type companies who will be interested in coming in to say, listen, we can partner with you. Let's draft a public-private partnership agreement where the government grants us the land, they give us the access, we come in, we build the facility, and at some point after we would have recovered our outlay, then we can start to share revenue with the government. But the government still makes money in the process because they've still got to charge fees, etc., for the use of the airport.
Well, it's not the existing concern with the existing airport, with the ownership of Hutchison, etc.
Yeah,
I mean,
but even that, I mean, that situation to me was a bit unfortunate. That the largest investor in Grand Bahama has made a decision not to rebuild the airport. I have some other thoughts on that, but take a whole other show to get around, right? But it doesn't mean, though, that because Hutchison is not interested, that you can't find another investor who has an interest in rebuilding that airport. But before we talk even about rebuilding the airport, that is a part of what I call the sustainable development plan that should be in effect for Grand Bahama. But, and again, we have that catch-22. So you can't bring quality investors into Grand Bahama without having a mode of transport, right? Airlift coming into Grand Bahama through an airport. And the airport has to be one that is conducive to receiving large volumes of people, but also the caliber of people that you expect to attract to Grand Bahama. But that's on the one hand. On the other hand, you can't build an airport without a plan of how you're going to fund it, how you're going to populate it. And looking at the airport that was there before, I'm told that perhaps the airport, they never really saw the full volume of people coming through the airport at any one time to want to expand the size of it. But we can certainly use this opportunity now to embrace how we can improve on how the airport functioned previously. Now, the idea of moving the airport from where it is to another location is something that those who are experts in there would have to discuss and plan out. But my concern would be, how do we attract the quality investor to consider Grand Bahama as still being a viable place to do business?
And I think that's going to be the challenge, whether you're finding the investor and showing them that it's viable.
Yeah.
I mean, for us, it's a necessity. We've got to get in and out of Grand Bahama, so we see it as a necessity, but you're talking about now making this attractive to people who wanted a return on the investment. So anyway, stay with us. We are at the point of a break in our show. You're watching On the Record. We're back right after this.
Unbelievable. Jesse Metcalfe stars as the Scrooge who wrote the book on staying single.
He's the only one who won't put decorations in his front yard.
Yes, you heard. But his neighbor is about to change all that.
Would it be so hard for you to get into the Christmas spirit?
It's been a bit of a struggle.
Maybe there's hope for you yet.
Christmas Next Door.
Only on our TV. I kind of like it.
From TV to phone to fast internet, how can we show appreciation for the 25 years you've been with Rev? To celebrate our 25th birthday, Rev is rewarding 250 lucky customers with $250,000 cash back. Simply switch to Trio, upgrade to Trio, or pay your bill in full and have your chance to win cash this Christmas. Just call 601-8992 or email us at trio@cablebahamas.com. Rev, you and us together.
This portion of On the Record brought to you by Generali, your employee benefits solutions provider.
You're watching On the Record, and this segment is brought to you by Generali. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Thank you for staying with us. After a disaster like Dorian and the extensive amount of damage left behind, we have to ask, where will the money come from? Joining us tonight to speak about the strategy the government is attempting to use to rebound is Mr. Edison Sumner. He's the founder and principal of Sumner Strategic Partners. Over the past few weeks, there's been a lot of discussion from the government side on what is going to happen, what they intend to do to keep us, I guess, financially and fiscally sound as a country. The Financial Secretary, Marlon Johnson, said the government had two choices, either increase taxes or borrow to make up for a shortfall that's anticipated within government revenue. Is that the way to go?
Well, you know, short term, the government needs to have access to capital quickly, right? Because even prior to Dorian, we were already hearing from the government that they were going to have a shortfall in revenue for this fiscal period. The hurricane came and sort of exacerbated that somewhat and extended the level and the leverage of loss the government would have experienced for this period, this year. So for the government to maintain its operations, looking at whatever capital developments it was doing, there needs to be access to immediate capital to support its programs and its policies, etc. However, in the longer term, I think that there are other options that may be available to the government to consider. One of them is going out, particularly as it relates to hurricane recovery. And we've seen coming out of the hurricanes, I've been involved in a massive group as well who were doing a lot of work on the ground that we just weren't talking about. But there are still a number of large international institutions and bodies who are willing to support the country. The government just has to decide whether it is willing to, and I do know of a program that I'm unable to speak to now, but I do know that the government is pursuing another avenue to raise awareness and to raise funds to support the hurricane disaster efforts. Taxation or borrowing have been the two hallmarks of governments for generations when it's time to raise money. But there are other ways I think the government can raise money. I mean, one of them, and again, it is borrowing to a degree where they start selling government stock to support certain infrastructural development. And the government borrows that money, but the pressure isn't as great as if they were to borrow from the IMF, for example, or the IDB. But I do think that there are other options that the government can consider. One of them I know that they're currently pursuing, and hopefully if it comes off the way I anticipate that it would, then that can raise significant sums of money for the government, well into the hundreds of millions of dollars, that will help to defray the cost of reconstruction, but also help to bring some level of easing the pressure on the government's coffers when it comes to dealing with some of their own recurring expenses that they've got to deal with.
Let's look at the taxation bar just for a moment. If you're talking about increasing the level of taxation and increasing some things, how does that affect an economy where people are already stretched? I mean, we would have seen the introduction of VAT, or the increase in VAT a few years ago.
Yeah.
Other things are going up, including electricity. You're talking about introducing additional forms of taxation. How is that going to affect the financial stability of the country and people who are now, again, having to dig deeper?
Yeah. Well, look at it this way. When in 2015, we introduced value-added tax, right? That was a bittersweet pill to swallow, meaning that it took effort to get people to accept that it was necessary to do that because the economy was in a bad way. In 2017, I think it was, we increased VAT from 7.5% to 12%. People were more upset about the increase than they were about the introduction of the tax in the first place, meaning that that it has a psychological impact on the citizens of this country. We understand, and here's the consensus that we came up with, right, out of these talks about taxation. The consensus has been that we understand that we have to pay taxes, right? We understand that the government needs to raise money to support infrastructure, education, transportation, paying the public service, etc. So we understand all of that. The concern has always been that, we are paying taxes as a country, but in a lot of ways, not in every sense, but in a lot of ways, there was questions about, well, what has been the impact of this tax collection? right? We're still seeing, in some cases, there's been some capital developments. In other cases, there hasn't been. In some cases, we've seen building up of schools, but we're still seeing that the average of kids leaving school is still abysmal, right? And then we're still not seeing the level of improvements in the level of service in the public sector or private sector, for that matter, that is all attributed to this increase in taxes where we're supposed to be paying for these things to improve the lives of Bahamians. The one thing that I believe Bahamians do not want to hear now, especially, is that we're going to be taxed further. Doesn't matter what kind of tax it is, what kind of a fee you call it. As long as it's going to hit me in my pocket, I'm going to feel it. And if it's going to hit me in my pocket at a time when I'm already in a depressed state, it's going to have an impact on me, my family, my business, my psyche. Any discussion at this point, in my view, that talks about imposing a new tax or increasing a tax on the Bahamian public at this rate is going to come or will be met with a level of resistance from the people, because the cry is that we really can't take any more right now, right? We're suffering. The economy from 2008, we started to see a little bit of a return about 2 years ago, but it's been very, very minimal. And now that we're going through the situation, because bear in mind now that even though this hurricane hit Grand Bahama and Abaco, people in the rest of the country felt almost as impacted because they had to take care of their family in those islands. They had to take them in. They had to be making financial contributions to all these drives that people were having towards hurricane relief efforts. Many families in Nassau and parts of Grand Bahama and other places are still taking care of families who were displaced from the hurricane.
And in other islands as well.
And in other islands. So they already feel that they're making their contribution towards hurricane relief by taking that burden off the government, getting those people who were in the shelters before out of the shelters into the homes of family members and taking care of them. But, you know, if I'm only earning $1, and whenever I go to purchase anything in this country, goods or service, I'm already spending 12 cents out of that dollar on VAT for charges, it's only leaving me with, 88 cents I have to spend. And out of that, I've got to take care of all the other bills I've got to cover. And now there's possibly going to be another charge on my 88 cents that's left that have to cover school fees, other forms of groceries, and whatever my other living accommodations expenses are. And anything that's going to now, dip into whatever funds I have left is going to cause a problem for the people in this country. So taxes, and I understand the reason that the government may want to raise taxes. I understand why they have to borrow, especially for short-term, to cover short-term expenses. But I think that we ought to consider other options in the long term of how we're going to relieve this pressure.
This is a question that has been on my mind that I've been sort of waiting to ask. And I have to preface this by saying that we're hoping to have the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance on the show this week, but he couldn't make it. That doesn't mean to say that I'm not happy to have you here. But the question that has loomed in my mind is, what would have been our fate had we not had, first of all, the introduction of value-added tax, and then the increase in value-added tax to decrease the level, or decrease the deficit to the point where government said it had been decreased, and to be able to have some extra money and to do things like pay the insurance, etc. Where would we have been, you think, had we not introduced VAT and even increased it?
Well, I mean, naturally, VAT brought in a lot of revenue to the government. In the first year or so that we introduced value-added tax, I think we collected revenue somewhere around $1 billion, right, which was a significant revenue stream for the government. I understand that since then it sort of tapered off, and we've not collected as much in the same period as we did in the first year of introducing VAT. So naturally, the introduction of VAT and the increase in the rate of VAT brought revenue to the government. But even though it brought in revenue to the government, we still heard that prior to Dorian, that the government is already experiencing, and their projections were that they were going to have a shortfall in their revenue streams. And that can be attributed to a number of reasons, right? Increase in expenses, capital cost, salaries, etc., repayment of outstanding loans, looking at the other contingencies that the government has to deal with. But the challenge is this, Jerome, in this economy, for you to make money, you've got to spend it, right? Money sitting there in a bank without activity is dead. It benefits nobody except the bank. And even the bank doesn't benefit because the bank has to lend money to make money. We've got to, as a country, and this is why I have no great difficulty with the government borrowing as long as it's done responsibly, for the government to increase and improve the level of employment, to create opportunities for entrepreneurs and others in the society, creating an environment for businesses to thrive. They have to spend money, capital developments, education, whatever it is they've got to do. But it has to be done responsibly to the degree that we're not going to find ourselves saddled with this burden for 20, 30 years at a time, and it's eating away at your future revenue. So if we hadn't increased or introduced value-added tax and hadn't increased the rate of VAT, then the revenue streams would not have been, I think, as significant as it has been. But at the same time, in this whole talk towards the country's accession to WTO, we started reducing the rate of customs duty, eliminating duties in a lot of cases, right? So there was a discussion, I know, about whether we should keep the value-added tax system as our form of taxation. At the time when it was introduced, it was considered to be the best option that we had at the time, right? But now there's discussions you're hearing around about the possible introduction of a corporate tax or an income tax. But if you would introduce a corporate tax and income tax, then you have to do away with value-added tax. You can't charge me VAT and charge me a tax on my salary, my earnings. And that goes for the individual as well as the corporation. So there has to be a study done, and there have been studies done already, in fact, to determine whether we should move away from the current taxation system and introduce a different form of taxation, being in corporate or income tax. But as we do it, then other taxes will have to fall away.
So you brought up a good point. So, you know, I don't know whether I'm sure you have been privy to some of those studies at some point, but what is a better form of taxation? Do we continue with the value-added tax and other taxes, or do we look to move to an income and corporate tax? Which, not that any form of taxation is better for the people that have to pay, but what, in your opinion, would make more sense for us in this environment?
Well, I'll tell you the difference. The difference is with value-added tax, everybody pays. But it is also seen or considered by many to be a tax of inequality, right? Meaning that you, Jerome Sawyer, earn $1 million a year, right?
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Speak that into my life.
You earn $1 million a year.
Sure.
I earn $100,000 a year. You and I go to the store, we buy the same items, and we're paying the same thing.
Right.
At the end of the day, I'm down from my $100,000 a year, maybe $80,000 a year. You're down $988,000 a year, right? So the difference then is that with value-added tax, everybody pays tax, whether you are considered amongst the most unfortunate or the poorest of those in the country, as opposed to those who are the wealthiest in the country. The income tax will be considered more equitable in that you now will pay based on your earnings. You pay a percentage based on your earnings. So if you are a large corporation and you're earning $100 million a year, then there's going to be a scale that I use, a sliding scale, to determine that I'm going to hit you with this income tax based on your level of earning. And that's more equitable because now you're earning $100 million, so you're going to pay X percent. I'm only earning $20,000, I'm going to pay a different percent of my earnings. And that's considered to be a little more equitable. And also the fact that corporations will now be required to pay this tax as well. Individuals pay it based on your earnings, your salary, but corporations will pay it based on their gross earnings as well. And that is apart from the business license fees and the rest of it. But there again is a question, because if we introduce an income tax, right, or a corporate income tax, then do we keep the business license fees in place? You cannot keep value-added tax and income tax in the same tax bracket. It will not work. And then you have to also consider, do we now continue to reduce our reliance on customs duty and import tax and excise tax and the rest of it if we can demonstrate that based on the studies done, and we can generate, $1.5 billion in income tax every year from all of these companies who are resident in the Bahamas, right? Because a lot of them get by without paying a lot of taxes they should pay. Then we can say, let's do away with the other taxation systems. But I think the government has to weigh the pros and cons and decide which one is going to be best for the society.
Edison Sumner, we're going to continue our discussion in just a minute. If you are just joining us, you're watching On the Record, stay with us. We're back right after this.
Maybe you have Rev Phone with its tons of awesome and free features. Or you're watching great content on Rev TV. Or maybe you have our blazing fast internet. So you already know how good it is to have one Rev service. Imagine if you had all three. With Trio, you get all of our services for $99. And you get entered into our $250,000 cashback Christmas. So the question is, why don't you have Trio? Just call 601-8992 or email us at trio@cablebahamas.com. Rev, you and us together.
People always talk about miracles at Christmas, right?
You need a donor as soon as possible.
Someone's out there.
You can't do this on your own.
You're gonna get through this.
Once Upon a Christmas Miracle.
Only on our TV.
This is On the Record. We thank you for staying with us tonight. Based on the Prime Minister's comments, 80% of storm-damaged homes and businesses were underinsured or uninsured. What this now means is that the burden rests on the government to fill that gap for private sector and private citizens. That's according to the Deputy Prime Minister, Peter Turnquest. With me tonight to discuss how this significantly threatens the country's finances and credit standing with the international rating agencies is Mr. Edison Sumner. He's the founder and principal of Sumner Strategic Partners. I want to go a little bit global for a moment and talk about what is at threat here. What threats are we under? We all remember clearly our downgrading and the work that has been done to get us onto a better platform, improve our rating, and the work that's being done constantly to monitor that and to ensure that we do not fall back into those categories. But when something like this happens, given the level of catastrophic damage, given the potential loss in revenue, the effects on the second and third largest economies in the country, does this put our international ratings at risk?
It could. But understanding that when you talk about international ratings and the sovereign credit rating of a country, it really speaks to the country's ability to satisfy its financial obligations, right? If we borrowed money in the international market, what is our capacity to repay that money without getting into default, that we are unable to satisfy the repayment? So when the government or the country takes on more financial burden, it has to also demonstrate that it has the capacity to meet those obligations. And that is where this whole idea of the ratings of a country's credit worthiness comes into play. So when the government now takes on the obligation of assisting homeowners and businesses to get back in business, then I'm sure there would have been a process within the government to determine that if we're going to extend ourselves by offering this $10,000 or so to homeowners who suffered loss in the hurricane and didn't have insurance, then there has to be a calculation of what is that going to cost us over the long haul, right? And what are going to be the conditions of making these funds available to these homeowners? Internationally, it's going to be a matter of determining if we extended ourselves further than we have already, understanding that the country is already having some challenges with its economy. I understand the government feels a sense of obligation to assist because you want to ensure that your citizens are living at a certain level of comfort in their lives. But it also will be something, I think, where the government will have to insist now going forward to avoid having to put its hands in its pockets again. Because we looked at this, and we had this discussion in 2015. We had this discussion in 2016.
After every hurricane.
After every hurricane.
We have this discussion.
So the discussion now is, how do we work with not only the local insurance industry, because they have insurers or reinsurers to answer to. So we talk about the local insurance industry and we talk about the fees they're charging us, right? But we understand that the fees they charge in many cases are fees that are passed down through them from their reinsurers. So I think it may be important, because the Bahamas has always been a hurricane zone, right?
And that will not change.
It will not change.
Yeah, we're not moving. Yeah.
So we know this. So I think to avoid having where the government has to put its hand in its pocket again to shell money out to come to individuals who do not have insurance on their homes, we need to have a serious discussion with the reinsurance community, with the local insurance industry, to find out ways, how do we now begin to mitigate or reduce the cost, or if you can't reduce the cost, how do we manage the cost better, right? In some cases they talk about building in different locations or constructing a different kind of structure, where if I had a structure before the hurricane and you charge me a certain rate for that structure because of the type of building that it was, if I were to rebuild that with different material, will my rates be different, right? And these are kind of discussions that we have to have. But the government has also made provisions to support not only the homeowners who lost their homes, who were uninsured, and we found again from years ago that many homes in this country do not have insurance on their properties, right? Some of them do it because they simply can't afford it. Others do it because they feel that I'm never going to be the one to need it, so why am I going to spend $5,000 a year for homeowners insurance when I've never had a reason to claim for it, and then one day it happens, and then you face the consequences. But they've also established a fund through a partnership of some of its subsidiaries, like the Venture Capital Fund, the Small Business Development Center, the Bahamas Development Bank, and also in partnership with a number of commercial banks, where the government has made a little over $10 million available to this consortium of agencies. And the entire purpose of this group, or of this initiative, is to provide support to the business communities in Grand Bahama and Abaco that were impacted by the hurricane. And that system is money that is coming not necessarily directly from the Treasury, but is coming out of those dormant accounts that were being held by the central bank, where the government is drawing funds from that account to support businesses. That, to me, is prudent to the degree that like I said, we need to recharge the economies, right? We need to get commerce moving again. So with that program, you have companies who were in existence before. This particular scheme doesn't speak to those new entrants into the market. So if you were in business before and you were impacted by the hurricane and you need support or help to get back in business, then you can access grant funding from the SBDC or loans up to a certain sum, or you can access debt or loans from some of the commercial banks that can be guaranteed by the SBDC. You can get funding from the Bahamas Development Bank up to a certain sum. And for those who need more money, right, where the tier is a little higher, you can get equity funding from the Venture Capital Fund, right? So there's a block of $50,000 to $100,000 or so. To me, that it works because those companies, once they're back in business, will also help to contribute towards the growth of the economy.
Sure, they employ
people, they will pay their taxes, they're going to improve the capital infrastructure of their environment, they're going to support others in business, etc. So the $10 million that the government is spending on this particular scheme is going to see returns for them.
Is it enough, though?
It's never enough. It is never enough. I mean, the fact is that if I speak, because I sit also as the deputy chair for the Venture Fund, so if I were to speak for them for a moment, our portion of that $10 million is $2 million. That's 20 businesses, right? You fund $100,000 per business, and 20 businesses or 20 applications, that money is gone. So we've got to be prudent how we do that. And that is why, to get the best benefit, a lot of the companies might come in with a sort of a hybrid approach, right? Meaning, if they need something in excess of, say, $500,000, they might come to the venture fund for a portion, go to the SBDC for a grant portion, go to the development bank for a portion, or perhaps go to a commercial bank for a portion, and that commercial bank side is being guaranteed by the SBDC. But the money is never enough, but we understand that there are also some limitations on the government.
Sure, I mean, it's not an unending sort of purse of money.
Exactly.
I want to speak to Grand Bahama for a bit. Unemployment rate said to be at 50% for the economy of Grand Bahama. Very grim news. But also in Freeport, right after the hurricane, Carnival Corporation and government signed the seal for the development of this $100 million cruise port. Looking first at the unemployment figure at 50%, what does that mean for that economy? But also when you have a development like this, which is on the horizon and getting set to begin, is it enough? Do we need more? There's still the Grand Lucayan in the mix. I want to talk about Grand Bahama for a moment.
Yeah. It's a start. In my view, Grand Bahama needs an injection of investments of no less than $1 billion to $2 billion.
Wow.
Right? Because bearing in mind that the Grand Bahama was already in a depressed state. Grand Bahama never recovered from the hurricanes Francis and Jean back in, was it 2001, I think, or 2002, somewhere around there. So Grand Bahama, in my view, has one of the greatest potentials to provide economic stimulus to this country. Because Grand Bahama, the city of Freeport in particular, but Grand Bahama is a massive land mass. There is good infrastructure in the ground. In fact, I think Freeport in particular has some of the best technology footprint you can find anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. We're not using it to its full potential yet. So Grand Bahama has the ability to again become the industrial capital of the country. In fact, it could become an industrial capital for the region because of how it's situated. But I think in Grand Bahama, there may be a need to see how we can separate the industrial side of Grand Bahama, the retail side of Grand Bahama, and the tourism side of Grand Bahama. Because we spend a lot of time talking about Freeport and the east side of Grand Bahama, but the west end of Grand Bahama, there is a ton of potential out there.
I agree with you 150%. It is a
There's even
sleeping
an airport out there,
Exactly,
Jerome.
Jakhtar. It's
Right?
it's a sleeping giant.
A sleeping giant that all it needs, in my view, is a little injection, a little shot, a little slap, and to say it's time to wake up and get things going. But that requires capital. Sure. And I think it's important for us to Freeport do their promotions very well, right? The Freeport, the Grand Bahama Port Authority have got their promotions arm, and they go out, Derek Newbold and those guys, and they promote Freeport. But Grand Bahama is such a vibrant place to do business that all we need to do is find a way to tell the story, bring investors in, but they have to come in where we have a plan for them when they arrive.
Sure, not just come in and sort of given a blank slate.
Yeah.
Edison Sumner is our guest tonight, our final segment on the record. Right after this. Welcome to On the Record.
Looking for more On the Record? If you miss our Thursday showing at 8 p.m., join us for the re-airing on Friday mornings at 10, and then again each Sunday night at 8:30. Or go to our YouTube channel and catch up on all of our past episodes. And then like our Facebook and Instagram pages for a preview of upcoming shows and get a chance to ask your questions. Just look for On the Record.
For Nikki DeLoach, this Christmas will be unlike any other.
My Nana made arrangements for the whole family to spend one last Christmas together at her house.
It'll be like old times.
A Christmas wish.
Oh my gosh, that's all of our old Christmas traditions.
And a chance to make it come true.
People spend their whole lives wishing they could spend Christmas in a place like this.
Bringing us all back together again, that was her gift.
Merry Christmas!
Reunited at Christmas.
Welcome back to On the Record. This is our final segment. My guest tonight, Mr. Edison Sumner. Within days, really, of the hurricane, government would have executed an exigency order to allow for hurricane relief supplies. Since then, they have removed VAT and as well as customs duties for the affected areas and for a significant period of time. Residents in those communities wanted it almost immediately. It said we need it for it to happen. Obviously, it is designed to help in the rebuilding. But how does that, if you look broadly now, how is that going to affect revenues? And greater than that, how is that now going to affect the finances of our country when our second and third largest ports, points of entry, communities, are exempt from a significant form of taxation?
Yeah, I think that the government doesn't expect to raise any revenue from this program in the short term. The fact is that the tax-free zones or the VAT-free zones are not going to be permanent. I think it's necessary to offer them some reprieve in order to get themselves back together, because if they are having a difficult time rebuilding the community, then ultimately it's going to affect the government's revenue. So in this instance, it's sort of, let me bite the bullet now because it's going to benefit me better in the future, as opposed to being so hardline and say, no, you have to pay these taxes because the government needs the money. But if you're imposing the tax on me and I still can't afford to buy the building material, I still can't afford to put my business back up in operations, then ultimately the government is going to be one that will suffer, because there will not be that level of impact for revenue on the economy of the country. So it's one of those necessary evils, I think, that the government has extended the exigency order to include now an exemption of value-added tax for a period of time. The challenge with it, though, and I'm not sure how they were able to iron this out, but the challenge was, if you purchased material in the tax-free zones or the VAT exempt zones, then of course you pay no VAT there. But the question was, how does that apply to merchants and homeowners who purchase property or purchase material, say in New Providence? How does that offset? And that's
you're still having to pay if you're purchasing on this end.
Right. So I'm sure that there has to be a way that the government has said, if you did that, then we're going to offer you some credits back at some stage. But I don't know exactly how that's working. But it is something that I think was necessary, that the government extended this to those areas. I just hope that others who live in those areas who weren't impacted by the hurricanes don't go and take advantage of it, because it's going to be like stealing out of the mouths of hungry people, right? And that should not happen. But it's necessary. It's not permanent, and the government just has to now either find another way to suck up the loss that they will incur because of it, or find another way to raise revenue to replace that loss over the same period of time.
I want to talk about two things: what went right and what went wrong. So let's talk about some of the things that you have seen that could and should have been done differently in the aftermath of this storm that could have set us up for a better outcome down the road.
Yeah. I go back to Matthew and Joaquin, the most recent hurricanes that we faced. Coming out of that, of those two situations, NEMA went through some severe criticism of its state of readiness, its preparedness, its being able to respond quickly after these things had passed. There was issues with the lines of communication, who should be doing what, and etc. So we saw some improvements in that over the years, right? Not optimally where it should be, but we've certainly seen some level of improvement. One of the things that the government has done in establishing this new ministry and this new authority, I think is something that if it works the way it is intended to work, that now NEMA will come under the auspices of this new ministry. There's now an authority that has been established. John Michael Clark, I think, has been appointed as its chair. that they now have the remit, and I read through the act that they're operating under, where in the case of these catastrophes and natural disasters, that they have now the authority in law to establish committees very quickly to deal with that specific disaster area. So the things that are being done right now, I think after the fact, is that we are putting measures in place that really should have been done a long time ago to support the disaster responsiveness, right? And also, now that we have a system to respond to disasters, we now need to consider how we can put a system in place to mitigate against it and planning for these disasters, right? There's still some criticisms that are being hurled around at government agencies for the way they handle certain things, but I think that, and I do want to extend compliments to the Prime Minister and his team, even though he was criticized for moving into some areas rather slowly. I think that he was able to galvanize some support quickly to start to put people in place to consider how we're going to respond to these issues. It's unfortunate when a lot of these things become political, because hurricanes, when it hits, doesn't look at your doorpost and decide, did Moses put the lamb over your door?
I've said it so many times on the show that we quickly politicize this, and it's very unfortunate.
Yeah. But listen, and just as a segue to that, right? I think, and I've made this statement before, that politics in this country, not politicians necessarily, but politics in this country is the culprit for a lot of the issues that we're facing in this country today. Politicians, I believe a lot of them have good intentions, but they've got a constituency of people to answer to, and these people are out for blood, right? Metaphorically speaking. So they feel and they bow to certain pressures, right? But if we were to remove politics from a lot of decision-making processes that we have to deal with in this country, I think that we can be much further ahead, much further advanced. Because if you get private sector people involved, civil society folks involved, I think you'll see things moving a lot more quickly. But even though you've got private sector folks involved, they quickly become subjected to the system of government, right? They've got to deal with different personalities, different systems, different protocols, and the rest of it. So if we can get around that, and that's why I was glad to see that this new authority is being staffed or being populated mostly with non-government folks. The government has a presence there because they need to, but to allow others to go in and to use unconventional methods that are not necessarily government methods in order to move some systems ahead. The government is going to benefit from it. The citizens are going to benefit from it. And hopefully what that's going to do for us is it will reduce the level of bureaucracy that's usually involved in responding to these kinds of disasters.
And I think that's been one of the, and it's an ongoing criticism, the level of bureaucracy that we face sometimes in responding to just simple things. Those are the things that create the great frustrations within people. And I think you're certainly onto something there. Before you go, I've got to ask you, the Bahamas was recently blacklisted by France, almost blindsided. Deputy Prime Minister has come out very harshly in criticizing that move. But what does that say? What does that mean? What are the implications for us?
First of all, I must say I support the Deputy Prime Minister's position on this. Right? I had an opportunity to send him a note in response to his statement in the House of Assembly. I think for too long, the Bahamas has been, as the old people would say, kowtowing to these OECD countries. They seem to, because you're doing something, bearing in mind that the Bahamas is a sovereign state, because you're doing something that they are not pleased with, they decide that they're going to put on this blacklisting or this list to say that you're an uncooperative jurisdiction. I think that we ought to get to a point in this country where we have to defend our sovereignty. They come up with these threats about they're not going to support the country or they're going to put sanctions against the country. And I've seen this happen before with some of those smaller Nordic states. And my question is, how many companies in this country come from these Nordic states? How many clients do we have from some of these Nordic and other European states that we should feel threatened because they are blacklisting us? So I support the Deputy Prime Minister's position on this. I think that the country's been bullied for too long by these OECD countries. And they're only after one thing. They're not after tax. I mean, they're after tax compliance, but their tax compliance is simply because they're losing tax revenue. The people who they wish are their citizens or corporate residents who may be from those countries, but they're doing business elsewhere. In their view, it's offshore. They're after taxes, right? They're not, I mean, yeah, they're concerned about our compliance rates and all that, but it's really about, I'm losing, $1 billion every year in taxes that should be paid to my jurisdictions being paid elsewhere. Because the international financial centers, as the Bahamas is, has structured their financial services industry to accommodate those kinds of individuals who are looking to plan their wealth better, plan their finances better, and it's nothing to do with tax evasion. It's all about wealth management and planning, tax planning. But the fact that France will come out and, like you said, almost blindsided this country. And I heard the Deputy Prime Minister's speech and I knew he was in France just days ago, met with the French authorities, and nothing was said to even give an indication that we're considering doing this. And he would have had a chance to head that off. But the fact that they've done it, it seems almost spiteful to me. I think the Bahamas should take a strong stance against it. I like the idea that he's met with the ambassador from France and he's expressed his concern about the approach to this. But I think that our approach should be just as strong. There are other countries in this region who've taken a stronger stance against these OECD countries. Cayman Islands decided, listen, you're not going to bully us the way you've bullied other people. You go into areas like Switzerland, which is a part of the OECD territory, and they will tell you, we're not going to bow to your pressures just because you say so. Now, I understand that we rely heavily on financial services in this country, but the question is, how much are we going to take from the OECD or from the G5 set of nations to determine that they are going to be the ones calling the shots on how we do business in this country? I think we've got to protect our sovereignty. We've got to protect the industry, yes, but it cannot come at any cost. We cannot be hopping around whenever they put a gun to our heads and they threaten to pull the trigger. We buckle at the knees and we start to comply based simply on their impressions that we aren't compliant with their rules.
Especially at a time like now when we have so many other financial considerations on the table.
Absolutely.
Edison Sumner, thank you so very much for joining us tonight. You've certainly given us a lot to think about and given some great perspective. I think, we have spent a lot of time just in this space looking at the humanitarian crisis, how people have been affected, how lives have changed and what's going to happen. We've looked at that aspect of the tragedy for so long, knowing that, outside of that, there's still another consideration, and that's the financial side of things. And so this has helped us to now put that into context. And thank you very much for coming on this evening.
My pleasure.
Always good to have you here. Always give us such great information. Thank you so very much. That's going to do it for our show tonight, folks. We want to thank you so much for staying with us. I also want to thank my guest, Mr. Edison Sumner, as well as my technical team here. Thank you so very much. Remember to follow us on Facebook and Instagram for updates. We'll see you next time right here on The Record.